The version of you that's trying to emerge right now has to bury the version of you that's been in charge for decades. And no one ever warns you that this internal burial feels like a real death. Your biology doesn't understand the difference between a psychological ending and a physical one. So when you begin the journey toward your authentic self, your entire system goes into emergency mode. It screams at you to turn around, to find safety in the familiar mask, even if that mask has been slowly starving you of meaning. Carl Jung spent his clinical career watching this exact phenomenon dismantle people. Not because the journey toward wholeness is flawed, but because culture never prepares us for the actual toll it demands. His patients would show up in his Zurich consulting rooms already shattered, convinced that their lives had catastrophically derailed. They were shedding partnerships, losing professional drive, failing to sustain the personality that had functioned adequately for 20 or 30 years. They were certain they were falling apart. Jung understood they were actually falling open. Yet he also understood something the modern wellness industry conveniently omits. Falling open ranks among the most excruciating experiences a conscious human can undergo. And pretending it feels like a gentle sunrise is a profound disservice to everyone currently living through it. Today we're going to walk through what Jung uncovered about the agony of self-realization. The three distinct losses that make this passage feel unbearable. And most importantly, why the ache you're carrying right now isn't a malfunction. It's the most reliable signal that something fundamental is finally, painfully, correctly aligning. Jung's entire framework for understanding this suffering emerged from a concept he refined over decades of clinical observation. He called it the individuation process. At its core, individuation means becoming a psychologically complete human being by reclaiming every part of yourself you were forced to disown, suppress, or conceal just to survive your early environment. On the surface, that sounds like a beautiful invitation. Become your real self. Make peace with your darkness. Arrive at wholeness. But Jung never sugarcoated what this looked like from the inside. And it bore zero resemblance to the peaceful enlightenment retreats marketed on social media. Individuation forces you to systematically dismantle the survival self you constructed to earn love and avoid rejection. And that survival self isn't a costume you can simply remove. It's bonded to your nervous system. It's woven into your most important relationships. It's the foundation of your career choices. It's tangled into every significant decision you've made for years, possibly decades. You cannot simply decide to be authentic and have your life neatly reorganize itself. You have to surgically separate structures that have grown into your living tissue. And that separation generates the pain. Jung noticed that almost no one begins individuating from a place of peaceful choice. They begin from collapse. Something essential breaks. A marriage ends. A career craters. A health crisis hits. A belief system shatters. And inside that wreckage, the survival self can no longer function. The persona they've been holding together fractures, and whatever has been waiting beneath begins forcing its way through, ready or not. This explains why genuine transformation never starts with inspiration. It starts with devastation. It starts when the life you constructed on borrowed foundations finally gives way, and you're left standing in the debris wondering who you are without the structure that once defined you. The first layer of pain Jung identified in this process is one that almost no one discusses with honesty. Becoming yourself requires grieving someone who was never truly alive. The person your parents needed you to be. The version your social circle approved of. The identity that kept everyone around you comfortable and undisturbed. That person felt completely real. You invested years, decades even, performing them. You sacrificed genuine preferences, authentic reactions, real desires to sustain that performance. And now, as you move toward who you actually are, you must confront the truth that the person you believed yourself to be, the one who received approval, who fit into groups, who understood their assigned role, was a construction, a survival adaptation, an elaborate performance you mistook for your identity. This grief carries a unique weight because you're mourning something that never drew a breath. You're grieving the loss of a self that was never genuine. Yet that false self is the only self you've ever known. Jung labeled the persona the social mask we wear, but he recognized that most people don't experience it as a mask. They experience it as their actual self. So when individuation begins peeling the persona away, it doesn't feel like removing a disguise. It feels like removing your own skin. Consider someone who has played the role of the dependable one for 30 years. The person who never complains, never asks for help, never prioritizes their own needs. That wasn't a role they consciously selected. It was survival. It was the version of themselves that received love, or at least received tolerance. And now something inside them is rejecting that identity. They're losing the capacity to maintain it. They're waking up exhausted by the performance without understanding why. They're feeling resentment toward the very people they've spent decades accommodating. And instead of recognizing this as the first stirring of authenticity, they feel like they're turning into someone terrible. Jung documented this constantly. Patients who were finally becoming genuine interpreted the process as moral collapse. They believed something was defective in them because they could no longer uphold the false self. They felt guilty for having boundaries, ashamed for expressing needs, terrified that without the persona, no one could possibly love what lurked beneath. And that terror wasn't irrational, because often the people in their lives had only ever loved the performance. The persona was the entry fee for those relationships, and dropping the persona meant gambling everything they'd built. This reveals the cruelty at the heart of individuation that Jung documented with unflinching clarity. Becoming yourself means discovering which of your connections were anchored to who you genuinely are, and which were anchored to who you were pretending to be. And you receive no advance warning. You only learn by becoming real and observing what remains. The second source of agony Jung mapped is the unavoidable meeting with the shadow. Every trait you rejected in yourself, every emotion you labeled unacceptable, every impulse you buried because it threatened your persona, all of it resides in the shadow. And individuation demands that you confront it, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a visceral, destabilizing encounter with aspects of yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding. Jung discovered that the shadow contains far more than what we typically label as dark. It contains whatever we've deemed incompatible with our chosen identity. The people-pleaser's shadow holds their rage. The caretaker's shadow holds their capacity for selfishness. The strong one's shadow holds their vulnerability. The peacekeeper's shadow holds their aggression. These aren't character flaws. They're amputated limbs of a whole person, and retrieving them feels like reaching into an open wound. The pain of shadow work comes from the collision between the story you've told yourself and the truth of who you are. For years you've maintained a narrative. I'm the compassionate one. I'm the patient one. I'm the one who never loses their temper. Then individuation shows you the moments you were cruel and looked away. The times your patience was actually fear. The anger you've compressed so deeply it's been leaking out as passive aggression, physical symptoms, or explosive outbursts that horrify you. Facing this doesn't feel like growth. It feels like discovering you're the antagonist in a story where you thought you were the hero. Jung described patients who moved through genuine shadow integration as experiencing a kind of ethical vertigo. Everything they believed about themselves became questionable. Their goodness, their motives, their relationships. Not because they were fundamentally bad, but because they were finally seeing themselves as complete humans. And complete humans contain everything: generosity and selfishness, compassion and cruelty, love and indifference. This is where most people attempt to halt the process. The confrontation with the shadow proves so destabilizing that the psyche pleads for relief. Go back to the persona. Resume the performance. At least the false self was comfortable. At least you knew who you were, even if that knowing was a lie. Jung called this the pull toward regression, and he watched countless patients surrender to it. They'd approach genuine integration, then retreat into the familiar false self because the truth about their own nature felt unbearable. But Jung also observed that you cannot unsee what you've witnessed. Once the shadow has been glimpsed, the persona never fits correctly again. You can attempt to resume the performance, but now you recognize it as performance. You can try to return to unconsciousness, but awareness has no reverse gear. So you become trapped in what Jung considered the most agonizing psychological position possible. Too conscious to go back, too frightened to move forward. Suspended between the death of who you were and the emergence of who you're becoming. Belonging fully to neither. The third loss that makes self-realization so brutal is the one Jung considered most devastating and most overlooked. It's the forfeiture of belonging. When you begin to individuate, you don't just lose a false self. You lose your position in every system that required that false self to operate. Your family assigned you a function. Your friendships were built around specific dynamics. Your workplace valued a curated version of you. Your intimate relationship depended on patterns you maintained without examination. And when you start becoming genuine, every single one of those systems feels the disruption. Jung described the individuating person as someone who becomes a stranger in their own existence. The family starts treating you differently because you're no longer fulfilling your assigned role. Friends grow uncomfortable because the equilibrium has shifted. Coworkers don't know how to interact without the familiar mask. And the people closest to you often respond not with encouragement, but with resistance. Because your transformation threatens the stability they depend on. This isn't because these people are malicious. It's because systems resist change. Jung understood that relationships function as psychological ecosystems. Everyone occupies a niche. Everyone plays a part. And when one person fundamentally changes, the entire system destabilizes. The family member who stops accepting blame disrupts the family strategy for managing shame. The caretaker who stops sacrificing themselves removes the resource everyone relied upon. The peacekeeper who starts speaking truth demolishes the illusion of harmony everyone was invested in maintaining. The pain here isn't merely social. It's existential, because belonging is a primary human need. We're wired for connection, for inclusion, for the sensation of having a place among others. And individuation temporarily strips that away. You no longer fit where you once fit, and you haven't yet located where you belong as the person you're becoming. Jung called this the threshold space, the passage between old identity and new, where you belong nowhere. This is where the isolation becomes nearly intolerable, not ordinary loneliness, something more fundamental. The loneliness of being mid-transformation in a world that has no category for what you're undergoing. You cannot explain it to those around you because they see the changes as problems. You're becoming distant. You're becoming selfish. You're not yourself anymore. And they're correct. You're not yourself anymore. But the self you're leaving behind was never genuinely you. And the self you're becoming hasn't fully arrived yet. So you exist in this unbearable gap where no version of you feels solid or real. Jung observed that this threshold period was where most people's transformation stalled or failed. Not because they lacked courage or insight, but because the isolation proved too complete. Humans aren't designed to endure prolonged disconnection from belonging. So they'd compromise. They'd become partially authentic, real enough to experience some relief from the persona, but not so real that they lost their place in their systems entirely. Jung called these half-individuated people, and he considered their position more painful than either full unconsciousness or full integration, because they could see clearly enough to know they were compromising, but they couldn't bear the cost of going all the way. What Jung found essential during this phase was what he termed the vessel, some structure or relationship that could contain the transformation without attempting to stop it. For some patients, that was the therapeutic relationship itself. For others, it was a single connection with someone who could witness the process without flinching. For a few, it was creative work that gave the transformation somewhere to flow other than just internal pressure. The essential truth was that individuation cannot happen in complete isolation, even though it feels profoundly isolating. You need at least one witness, one person or practice that communicates. I see what's happening, and I'm staying. But Jung was relentlessly honest about something else. Even with a vessel, even with support, the process still hurts. There is no version of becoming yourself that bypasses the pain. You cannot individuate comfortably. You cannot integrate your shadow gently. You cannot shed your persona without feeling skinless. The pain isn't evidence that you're doing it incorrectly. The pain is the process itself. And anyone telling you that transformation should feel like expansion and joy and ease is selling you another persona to replace the one that's dying. This is what remains unspoken. The self-development industry frames personal growth as accumulation. You accumulate mindfulness. You accumulate gratitude. You accumulate better habits. You become an upgraded version of who you already were. But individuation isn't accumulation. It's removal. It's loss. It's the systematic stripping away of everything you are not, so that what remains is what you actually are. And that stripping doesn't feel like liberation while it's happening. It feels like annihilation. Jung noticed that patients who understood this paradox moved through the process differently, not with reduced pain, but with reduced panic. When you know that the dissolution is part of the design, you stop interpreting it as failure. When you understand that the grief is proof of genuine change rather than evidence that something's wrong, you can hold the grief without being consumed by it. When you recognize that the isolation is temporary even though it feels permanent, you can endure it without retreating into a false self just to escape the emptiness. He also discovered that the pain changes quality as individuation deepens. In the early stages, the pain is sharp. It's the acute loss of identity, the shock of meeting your shadow, the sudden fracture in relationships. But as integration progresses, the pain becomes something different, a kind of gentle ache, the soreness of muscles learning to bear weight differently. Not the agony of destruction, but the discomfort of rebuilding. You're being reconstructed from within, and the new structure hasn't yet solidified. Everything feels exposed, tender, unfamiliar. But the panic begins to subside because beneath the unfamiliarity, you sense something solid forming that was never there before. Jung described this as the emergence of the self with a capital S, the deeper center of the psyche that exists beneath the persona, beneath the ego, beneath all the constructed identities. The self doesn't need to perform, doesn't need approval, doesn't need to fit into systems that require falseness. The self simply is, and making contact with it, even briefly, produces a kind of quiet conviction that everything you're losing was worth losing. Because what's emerging is authentic in a way nothing before ever was. But Jung cautioned against romanticizing this emergence. It doesn't arrive as a triumphant moment. There's no soundtrack, no revelation that retroactively justifies all the suffering. The self emerges gradually, often imperceptibly, like dawn arriving so slowly you cannot identify the moment darkness became light. You just realize at some point that you're making decisions based on something genuine rather than performing. That your relationships have become smaller but honest. That you've stopped seeking validation from people whose approval required your self-abandonment. That the weight you carried for years has lifted. Not because your problems vanished, but because you stopped carrying problems that were never yours to begin with. This is what becoming yourself looks like on the other side. Not a dramatic metamorphosis into some elevated being. A quiet arrival into someone you recognize as real. Someone whose choices align with their actual values rather than their survival strategies. Someone who can sit in silence without anxiety because they're no longer running from what's inside them. Someone whose relationships are built on mutual authenticity rather than mutual performance. Jung would want you to know something if you're in the middle of this passage right now. The pain you're feeling has a name, a structure, and a purpose. It's not meaningless suffering. It's not evidence of weakness or failure or brokenness. It's the specific, documented, predictable experience of a human being in the process of individuation. Every person who has ever become genuinely themselves has traveled through this territory. The grief, the shadow confrontation, the loss of belonging, the threshold isolation. It's the cost of admission to your own life. And here's what Jung observed about the people who completed the journey. They didn't complete it by being stronger than others. They didn't possess some quality that weaker people lacked. They completed it by refusing to interpret the pain as a reason to stop, by continuing to be honest when every part of them screamed to resume the performance, by sitting in the loneliness without letting it convince them that connection was only possible through falseness, by trusting that the process had a destination even when they couldn't see it. You are not falling apart. You are falling into yourself. And the pain of that falling is the most reliable evidence that the ground you land on will be real. Everything before this was built on someone else's blueprint for who you should be. What's forming now in the wreckage of that borrowed design is the first structure that's actually yours. It won't be as polished. It won't be as impressive to others. It won't earn the same approval. But you'll be able to live in it without the constant exhausting work of pretending it fits when it never did. That's what no one tells you about becoming yourself. Not that it's beautiful, not that it's enlightening, not that it feels like coming home. Those things might be true eventually. But first it feels like losing everything. Like the ground opening up. Like being asked to trust a process that looks from the inside indistinguishable from destruction. Jung spent his life studying this transformation. And the most important thing he discovered wasn't a technique or a concept or a framework. It was this simple, devastating, liberating truth. The pain of becoming yourself is not the obstacle to your transformation. It is the transformation. And the only way out is through. If this video resonated with where you are right now, take a moment to like it and join the community here at Winds of Thought. We're exploring these depths together.